personally engaged with the President of Ukraine in order to demonstrate full U.S. support for him. When the inauguration team returned to the United States, they had a meeting with President Trump on May 23. The May 23 meeting with President Trump proved to be important for two good reasons. First, with Ambassador Yovanovitch out of the way, President Trump authorized Ambassador Sondland, Secretary Perry, and Ambassador Volker to lead engagement with the new administration in Ukraine. And two, President Trump instructed them to satisfy Giuliani's concerns in order to move forward on Ukraine matters. These officials were all political appointees, and Ambassador Sondland had donated $1 million to the president's inauguration. The president saw these three political appointees as officials who would fulfill his requests. Ambassador Volker testified that he, Ambassador Sondland, Secretary Perry, and Senator Johnson took turns making their case that this is a new crowd. It's a new president in Ukraine. He's committed to doing the right things, including fighting corruption. They recommended that President Trump follow through on his invitation for President Zelensky to meet with him in the Oval Office. But President Trump did not receive the recommendation well. At his public hearing, Ambassador Volker described the May 23rd Oval Office meeting with President Trump. Let's listen.
We stressed our finding that President Zelensky represented the best chance for getting Ukraine out of the mire of corruption it had been in for over 20 years. We urged him to invite President Zelensky to the White House. The president was very skeptical. Given Ukraine's history of corruption, that's understandable. He said that Ukraine was a corrupt country full of terrible people. He said, they tried to take me down. In the course of that conversation, he referenced conversations with Mayor Giuliani. It was clear to me that despite the positive news and recommendations being conveyed by this official delegation about the new president, President Trump had a deeply rooted negative view on Ukraine rooted in the past. He was receiving other information from other sources, including Mayor Giuliani, that was more negative, causing him to retain this negative view.
Witnesses said the reference to taking me down was to unfounded allegations that Ukraine had interfered in the 2016 election. This was what President Trump considered to be corruption in Ukraine. The president's words echoed Giuliani's public statements about Ukraine in early May. Rather than committing to an Oval Office meeting with the Ukrainian leader, President Trump directed the delegation to talk to Giuliani. Here is how Ambassador Sondland described that instruction from the president.
If we wanted to get anything done with Ukraine, it was apparent to us we needed to talk to Rudy.
Right. You understood that Mr. Giuliani spoke for the president, correct?
That's correct.
Ambassador Sondland saw the writing on the wall. Sondland concluded that if we did not talk to Rudy, nothing would move forward on Ukraine. The three amigos, as they called themselves, did as the president ordered and began talking to Giuliani. Dr. Hill testified, Volker, Sondland, and Perry gave us every impression that they were meeting with Rudy Giuliani at this point, and Rudy Giuliani was also saying on the television, and indeed has said subsequently, that he was closely coordinating with the State Department. Like Dr. Hill, Ambassador Bolton closely tracked Giuliani's Ukraine-related activities. Hill testified about a conversation she had with Bolton in May of 2019. That conversation was revealing, so let's listen.
on television making these statements. And I had already brought to Ambassador Bolton's attention the attacks, the smear campaign against Ambassador Yovanovitch, and expressed great regret about how this was unfolding and, in fact, the shameful way in which Ambassador Yovanovitch was being smeared and attacked. And I'd asked if there was anything that we could do about it. And Ambassador Bolton had looked pained, basically indicated with body language that there was nothing much that we could do about it. And he then, in the course of that discussion, said that Rudy Giuliani was a hand grenade that was going to blow everyone up.
Did you understand what he meant by that?
I did, actually.
What did he mean?
Well, I think he meant that, obviously, what Mr. Giuliani was saying was pretty explosive in any case. He was frequently on television making quite incendiary remarks about everyone involved in this, and that he was clearly pushing forward issues and ideas that would, probably come back to haunt us. And, in fact, I think...
According to Hill's description, Bolton said that Giuliani's influence could be an obstacle to increased White House engagement with Ukraine. He instructed his staff not to meet with Giuliani. In June, Volker and Sondland relayed to Ambassador Taylor that President Trump wanted to hear from Zelensky before scheduling the meeting in the Oval Office. Ambassador Taylor testified that he did not understand at the time what that meant. Around this time, the president publicly expressed that he thought it would be okay to accept foreign interference to assist his campaign if it was in the form of opposition research on his opponent. Let's listen to that shocking interview.
The campaign this time around, if foreigners, if Russia, if China, if someone else offers you information on an opponent, should they accept it or should they call the FBI?
I think maybe you do both. I think you might want to listen. There's nothing wrong with listening. If somebody called from a country, Norway, we have information on your opponent. Oh, I think I'd want to hear it.
You want that kind of interference in our elections?
It's not an interference. They have information. I think I'd take it.
Shocking video. Meanwhile, Giuliani continued to press Ukraine to do the president's political dirty work. On June 21, for instance, Giuliani tweeted the following: "New press of Ukraine still silent on investigation of Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election and alleged Biden bribery of President Poroshenko. Time for leadership, and investigate both if you want to purge how Ukraine was abused by Hillary and Obama people." The quid pro quo scheme was taking shape. Giuliani was publicly advocating for Ukraine to conduct politically motivated investigations, while President Trump refused to schedule an Oval Office meeting for Ukraine's new president. As Ambassador Sondland testified, the scheme to pressure Ukraine to conduct these investigations would only get more insidious with time.
Mr. Chief Justice, the Majority Leader expressed a preference for a break about 2 hours in, so it's the House Manager's request that I present, and then we take the break if that's acceptable for everybody. Mr. Chief Justice, members of the Senate, Counsel for the President, and the American people, where were you on July 25th, 2019? It was a Thursday. Members of the U.S. Senate were here in this chamber. On July 25th, across the Atlantic, our 68,000 troops stationed throughout Europe were doing what they do every day: training and preparing to support our allies and defend against Russia. The professionalism and sacrifice of our men and women in uniform is a source of great strength. But America is also strong, and America is also secure because we have friends. On July 25th, 2019, one of those friends was a man named Alexander Markiv. In a story told by Sabra Ayers of the Los Angeles Times, Alexander was a soldier in the Ukrainian army, defending his country and Europe against Russian-backed forces on Ukraine's Eastern Front. He was in a trench. He was 38 years old. Alexander would later die defending his country during a mortar attack on his fighting position, giving his life, just like over 13,000 of his fellow Ukrainians, on the front lines of the fight for liberty in Europe. That same Los Angeles Times article painted a picture of what the Ukrainians were going through during this time. Quote, "Tens of thousands of Ukrainians, like Markiv, volunteered to help fight the Russian-backed separatists in the East. Many of them were sent to the front line wearing sneakers and without flak jackets and helmets, let alone rifles and ammunition. Ukrainians across the country organized in an unprecedented, united civil movement not seen since World War II to raise money to supply their ragtag military with everything from soldiers' boots to bullets. And while our friends were at war with Russia, wearing sneakers, some without helmets, something else was happening. On July 25th, President Trump made a phone call. He spoke with Ukrainian President Zelensky and asked for a favor. And on that same day, just hours after his call, his administration was quietly placing an illegal hold on critical military aid to support our friends. So why should any American care about what's happening in Ukraine? Timothy Morrison, former senior director for Europe and Russia at the NSC, put it bluntly.
Third, I continue to believe Ukraine is on the front lines of a strategic competition between the West and Vladimir Putin's revanchist Russia. Russia is a failing power, but it is still a dangerous one. The United States aids Ukraine and her people so they can fight Russia over there, and we don't have to fight Russia here. Support for Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty has been a bipartisan objective since Russia's military invasion in 2014. It must continue to be.
We help our partner fight Russia over there so we don't have to fight Russia here. Our friends on the front lines and trenches with sneakers. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014, the United States has stood by Ukraine. Our diplomats and military commanders have long said that supporting Ukraine makes us safer. But you don't need me to tell you that. You all know it very well. When the funding for this security assistance came up for a vote under this roof, 87 of you voted for the aid. And many of you have been staunch advocates for Ukraine, working in a nonpartisan way to support our friends. And that support makes a lot of sense, because politics should not play a part in ensuring that Ukraine can battle Russian aggression and ensure that freedom wins in Europe. This body has in so many ways set that example. Protecting Europe from Russia is not a political game. Let me provide some background. In early 2014, in what became known as the Revolution of Dignity, Ukrainian citizens demanded democratic reforms and an end to corruption, ousting the pro-Russian president. Within days, Russian military forces and their proxies invaded Ukraine, annexing Crimea and occupying portions of eastern Ukraine. Since 2014, more than 13,000 Ukrainians have been killed because of the conflict, and over 1.4 million have been forced from their homes. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the first attempt to redraw Europe's borders since World War II. In 2017, then Secretary of Defense James Mattis summed it up well. He said, quote, "Despite Russia's denials, we know they are seeking to redraw international borders by force, undermining the sovereign and free nations of Europe." And as Ambassador Taylor put it, Russian aggression in Ukraine dismissed, quote, "dismissed all the principles that have kept the peace and contributed to prosperity in Europe since World War II." It's clear that Russia is not just a threat in Europe, but for democracy and freedom around the world. Our friends and allies have also responded, imposing sanctions on Russia and providing billions of dollars in economic, humanitarian, and security assistance to Ukraine. This has been an international effort. Today, the European Union is the single largest contributor of foreign assistance to Ukraine, having provided roughly $12 billion in grants and loans since 2014. And the United States has provided over $3 billion in assistance in that time. Because we all know that we can't separate our own security from the security of our friends and allies. That's why the U.S. has provided economic security and humanitarian assistance in the form of equipment and training. Ambassador Taylor testified that American aid is a concrete demonstration of our, quote, "commitment to resist aggression and freedom and defend freedom." He also detailed the many benefits of our assistance for Ukraine's forces.
Mr. Chairman, the security assistance that we provide it takes many forms. One of the components of that assistance is counter-battery radar. Another component are sniper weapons. These weapons and this assistance allows the Ukrainian military to deter further incursions by the Russians against Ukrainian territory. If that further incursion, further aggression were to take place, more Ukrainians would die. So it is a deterrent effect that these weapons provide. It's also the ability, it gives the Ukrainians the ability to negotiate from a position of a little more strength when they negotiate an end to the war in Donbass, negotiating with the Russians. This also is a way that would reduce the number of Ukrainians who would die.
I would like to make a finer point of how this type of aid helps, because I know something about counter-battery radar. In 2005, I was an Army Ranger serving in a Special Operations Task Force in Afghanistan. We were at a remote operating base along the Afghan-Pakistan border. And frequently, the insurgents that we were fighting would launch rockets and missiles onto our small base. But luckily, we were provided with counter-battery radar. So 20, 30, 40 seconds before those rockets and mortars rained down on us, an alarm would sound. And we would run out from our tents and jump in to our concrete bunkers and wait for the attack to end. This is not a theoretical exercise, and the Ukrainians know it. For Ukraine, aid from the U.S. actually constitutes about 10% of their military budget. It's safe to say that they can't fight effectively without it. So there is no doubt U.S. military assistance to Ukraine makes a real difference in the fight against Russia. In 2019, Congress provided $391 million in security assistance. This included $250 million through the Department of Defense, the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, USAI, and $141 million through the State Department's Foreign Military Financing Program, FMF. President Trump signed the bill to authorize this aid in August 2018 and signed another bill to fund it the following month. The aid was underway. The train was leaving the station and following the same track it had followed every single year. But all of this was about to change. In July of 2019, President Trump ordered the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, to put a hold on all of the aid. The president personally made this decision even after his own appointed advisors warned him that it wasn't in our country's interest to withhold the aid, after overwhelming support in this Senate and against long-standing policy even in his own administration. But what's most interesting to me about this is that he was only interested in the Ukraine aid, nobody else. The U.S. provides aid to dozens of countries around the world, lots of partners and allies. He didn't ask about any of them, just Ukraine. The most important question here is, why would he do that? What was his motivation? Well, we now know why. This hold shocked people across our own government. The Department of Defense, along with the State Department, had already certified to Congress that Ukraine had implemented sufficient anti-corruption reforms to get the funds. And the Defense Department had already notified Congress of its intent to deliver the assistance. So let's recap all of this. Congress had already funded it. Our own government had already certified that it met all the standards it had met every other year. And Congress had already been notified just like every other year. In a series of meetings of the national security agencies, everyone except the OMB supported the provision of the assistance. And OMB, as we know, is headed by Mick Mulvaney, the President's Chief of Staff. Ukraine experts at DoD, the State Department, and the White House emphasized that it was in the national security interest of the U.S. to continue to support Ukraine in its fight. But it wasn't just the national security concern, because many people thought that the hold was just outright illegal. And they were right. It was. The president's hold did violate the law, because just last week, Congress's independent, nonpartisan watchdog, the Government Accountability Office, released an opinion finding that the hold was illegal. President Trump held the military aid money for so long that the administration ran out of time to spend the money. Ultimately, even after the president lifted the hold on September 11th, again with no clear explanation why, we, the Congress, had to pass another law to extend the deadline, delaying the delivery of the aid. In the same LA Times article that told the story about our friend Mr. Markiv, Ukrainian defense spokesperson said that even though the hold had been lifted, this was in September, quote, "It has not reached us yet." That spokesperson went on to say, quote, "It is not just money from the bank, it is arms, equipment, and hardware." And to this day, millions of dollars still haven't been spent. Although our government neither informed Ukraine of the hold nor publicly announced it, Ukraine quickly learned about it. On July 25th, the same day as President Trump's call with President Zelensky, officials at Ukraine's embassy here in Washington emailed DoD to ask about the status of the funding. By mid-August, officials at DoD, the State Department, and the NSC received numerous questions from Ukrainian officials about the hold. Everyone was worried. And not just because of the urgent need for the equipment on the front lines, but also because of the message that it sent. You see, President Zelensky had just been sworn in. They were very vulnerable. And as we all know, Vladimir Putin looks for vulnerability. He looks for hesitation. He looks for delay. And any public sign of a hold on that aid could be a sign of weakness that could show him it was time to pounce. President Trump's hold on the Ukraine assistance was eventually publicly reported on August 28th. As we will explain, Ukraine fully understood that the hold was connected to the investigations that President Trump wanted. On February 28th, DOD notified Congress that it had intended to deliver $125 million of assistance appropriated in September, including, quote, more than $50 million of assistance to deliver counter-artillery radar and defense lethal assistance. Congress cleared the notification, which enabled DOD to begin spending the funds. For Ukraine to receive the remaining $125 million, Congress required that the Secretary of Defense, in coordination with the Secretary of State, certify that the government of Ukraine had taken substantial anti-corruption reforms. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Laura Cooper and senior officials across our government conducted a review to evaluate whether Ukraine had met the required benchmarks. Ms. Cooper explained that the review involved, quote, pulling in all the views of the key experts on Ukraine defense and coming up with a consensus view, which was then run up the chain in the Defense Department to quote, ensure we have approval. By May 23rd, the anti-corruption review was complete and DOD certified to Congress that Ukraine had complied with all of the conditions and that the remaining half of the aid should be released. But again, you don't have to take my word for it. On May 23rd, in a letter to Congress, one of President Trump's senior political appointees, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, wrote, quote, on behalf of the Secretary of Defense and in coordination with the Secretary of State, I have certified that the government of Ukraine has taken substantial actions to make defense institutional reforms for the purposes of decreasing corruption, increasing accountability, and sustaining improvements of combat capability enabled by U.S. assistance, end quote. Congress then cleared the funding, which should have allowed Ukraine to receive the aid, but we know that's not what happened. On June 18th, as DOD was preparing to send the aid, they issued a press release, like they normally do, announcing that it would provide $250 million in security assistance to Ukraine for, quote, additional training, equipment, and advisory efforts to build the capacity of Ukraine's armed forces. So this included sniper rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, counter-artillery radar, command and control, electronic warfare, secure communications, vehicles, night vision, and medical equipment. However, according to the New York Times, one day after the Defense Department issued this press release, one day, Assistant to the President Robert Blair, who works for Mick Mulvaney, called OMB, Acting Director Russell Vought, to tell him, quote, we need to hold it up. The it was the assistance. That same day, June 19th, President Trump gave an interview on Fox News where he raised the so-called CrowdStrike conspiracy theory that Ukraine, not Russia, had interfered in the 2016 election, a line he would echo during his July 25th call with President Zelensky. This theory, by the way, has been advanced by Russian propaganda to try to take attention away from Russian interference and shift it onto Ukraine. And it's a theory that has been universally debunked by U.S. intelligence and law enforcement. Nonetheless, the president, spurred by the June 18th press release, and with the false theory that Ukraine interference in the with the false theory about the Ukraine interference, supposedly, in the 2016 election, the president started asking about the Ukraine assistance. And on June 19th, OMB Associate Director for National Security, Michael Duffy, emailed Elaine McCusker, the DOD comptroller. He said, quote, the president had questions about the press report and that he was seeking additional information. This was a reference to an article in the Washington Examiner, shown here on the slide in front of you. The White House withheld this email from the House, of course. We first learned of it from Duffy's deputy, Mark Sandy, who testified that he was copied on it. Subsequently, as a result of a lawsuit under the Freedom of Information Act, the public, and therefore Congress, received a copy of that email. But the White House still refuses to comply with the subpoenas for this and other documents. On June 20th, McCusker responded to President Trump's inquiry by providing Sandy information on the Security Assistance Program. Sandy shared the information with Duffy, but he did not know whether Duffy shared the information with the White House. Laura Cooper also recalled receiving an email inquiry about Ukraine security assistance, quote, a few days after DOD's June 18th press release. She noted that it was, quote, relatively unusual to receive questions from the president. In response, DOD provided materials explaining that the $250 million funding package was for additional training, equipment, advisory efforts to build the capacity of Ukraine's armed forces. DOD emphasized, quote, almost all of the dozens of vendors are U.S. companies, meaning that this funding also benefited U.S. businesses and workers. Nonetheless, President Trump put the wheels in motion to freeze the funds shortly after learning about DOD's plan to release the funds. According to a New York Times article on June 27th, Chief of Staff Mulvaney emailed Blair, quote, I'm just trying to tie up some loose ends. Did we ever find out about the money from Ukraine and whether we can hold it back? Blair reportedly responded that it would be possible but not pretty. He added, quote, expect Congress to become unhinged. And I suppose he said that for all the reasons we talked about earlier, because this chamber and our chamber on the other side of the Capitol resoundingly supports it. And that was just the Defense Department assistance to Ukraine. For 2019, Congress also appropriated $141 million to Ukraine through the State Department. Unlike the Defense Department funding, which was approved by Congress and ready to be spent, OMB blocked the State Department from even seeking Congress's approval to release the funds. And I'd like to pause here to once again stress that we have learned a lot about the circumstances around the initial hold only from the public release of and reporting about these emails in the past few weeks. The White House has refused to provide these emails in response to a subpoena. Mick Mulvaney and Rob Blair refused to comply with a subpoena to testify. These emails are just a few of the many thousands that likely exist on this topic, but which have been concealed from Congress and the American people because of the ongoing obstruction. In fact, last night, as we were here late into the night, sometime around midnight, a new tranche of documents were released under a Freedom of Information Act request by an independent watchdog that had been asking for them. They were released last night between Mr. Duffy and Elaine McCusker and others on the things that I'm talking about right now. Unfortunately, as you can see, there isn't a lot to read here because it's all blacked out. So if the president's lawyers contest any of the facts that I'm talking about, you should demand to see the full record. The American people deserve to see the full truth when it comes to presidential actions. But back to the timeline. From July to September 2019, the President and his advisors at the White House and OMB implemented the hold on Ukraine assistance through an unusual and unlawful process. First, on July 3rd, the State Department notified DOD and NSC staff that OMB was blocking this notification to Congress. According to Jennifer Williams, Vice President Pence's aide, the hold on this assistance, quote, came out of the blue because it had not been previously discussed by OMB or NSC. Around July 12th, President Trump directed that a hold be placed on the DOD security assistance as well. That day, Mr. Blair sent an email to Duffy at OMB informing him that, quote, that the President is directing a hold on military support funding for Ukraine. Around July 15th, Tim Morrison learned from Deputy Director or Advisor Charles Kupperman, quote, that it was the President's direction to hold the assistance. Several days later, Duffy and Blair again exchanged emails about Ukraine and security assistance. And Sandy testified that in these emails, Duffy asked Blair about the reason for the hold. Blair provided no explanation. Instead, he said, quote, "We need to let the hold take place," and then, quote, "revisit the issue with the President." Between July 18th and July 31st, the NSC staff convened several interagency meetings at which the hold on security assistance was discussed. Remember those dates, July 18th to July 31st. According to Mark Sandy and other witnesses, several facts emerged. First, the agencies learned that the President himself had directed the hold through OMB. Second, no justification or explanation was provided for the hold, despite repeated questions. Third, except for OMB, all agencies supported military aid because it was in the national security interest of the United States. And fourth, many were concerned that the hold was outright illegal. Ambassador Taylor learned of the hold on July 18th. He said, quote, "The directive had come from the President to the Chief of Staff to OMB and that he, quote, sat in astonishment because one of the key pillars of our strong support for Ukraine was threatened." David Holmes, a diplomat at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv, testified that he was shocked by the hold. Although there was initially some question as to whether the hold applied to DoD funds, which was already cleared by Congress, it soon became clear that the hold applied to all $391 million. Tim Morrison testified that DoD officials raised concerns at a meeting on July 23rd about whether it was, quote, actually legally permissible for the President to not allow for the disbursement of the funding. These concerns related to possible violations of the Impoundment Control Act, the law that gives the President the authority to delay or withhold funds only if Congress is notified of those intentions and approves the proposed action. Of course, neither of those things had been done. The issue was escalated quickly, and at a senior-level meeting on July 26th, OMB remained the lone voice for holding the aid. According to Tim Morrison, OMB said that President Trump was concerned about corruption in Ukraine. Cooper from DoD also attended the July meeting. She received no further understanding of what was meant by corruption. There was never a principals meeting convened on this issue, but there was a fourth and final interagency meeting on July 31st. Remember that date? A fourth and final one. There is a process for making sure that U.S. aid money makes it to the right place, to the right people. And Mr. Chief Justice, I do see a lot of members moving and taking a break. We would like to take a break at this time. I have another probably 15 minutes.
Oh, I think we can continue.
Okay.
If I may, what I was going to suggest was at 6:30, we take a 30-minute break for dinner. Okay. If that would work.
So break at 6:30? Yep, okay.
What I was going to suggest was a break for dinner at 6:30 for about 30 minutes. Does that work? Yeah.
Okay. So we know there was a hold, but there was no lawful way to implement that hold. So the OMB had to use creative methods. There is a process for making sure that U.S. aid money makes it to the right place, to the right people, a process that has been followed every year since Congress approved security assistance to Ukraine. The administration needed to find a creative way of getting around that process. Later in the evening of July 25th, the OMB found that way, even though DoD had already notified Congress that the funds would be released. Here is how it worked. First, OMB issued guidance asserting that there was an ongoing review of assistance, even though none of the witnesses who testified were aware of any review of assistance. Second, OMB also attempted to hide the hold in a series of technical footnotes and funding documents. And third, OMB's leadership also transferred responsibility for approving funding obligations from career civil servant Mark Sandy to a political appointee, Mark Duffy, someone with no relevant experience in this funding. Based on recent public reporting and documents DoD released under the Freedom of Information Act, we learned that on July 25th, approximately 90 minutes after President Trump's phone call with President Zelensky, Mr. Duffy put this three-pronged plan into motion when he sent an email to senior DoD officials, copying Sandy. The email is in front of you. In this email, Duffy stated, quote, "Based on guidance I have received and in light of the administration's plan to review assistance to Ukraine, please hold off on any additional DoD obligations of these funds pending direction from that process." Duffy also underscored, quote, "Given the sensitive nature of the request, I appreciate you keeping that information closely held to those who need to know to execute the direction." In other words, don't tell anybody about it. Later that day, Sandy approved and signed the first July 25th funding document, which delayed funding until August 5th. Sandy testified that the purpose of this and subsequent footnotes, quote, was to preclude obligation for a limited period of time, but enable planning and casework to continue. Sandy also testified that his use of footnotes was unusual and that in his 12 years of OMB experience, he could, quote, not recall another event like it. On July 29th, Duffy told Sandy he would no longer be responsible for approving the release of DoD Ukraine funding. This was only weeks after Sandy had raised questions about the legality of the president's hold. Duffy also revoked the authority for approving the release of the State Department funding from Sandy's colleague at OMB. In short, Duffy assumed approval authority for all $391 million of the assistance. Over the next several weeks, with Duffy in charge, OMB continued to issue funding documents that kept kicking the can down the road, supposedly to allow for an interagency process. And remember, an interagency process that had already wrapped up back in July. While inserting the whole time footnotes throughout the apportionment documents, stating that the delay wouldn't affect the program. And yet concerns continued to be relayed within DoD that it had. In total, OMB issued 9 of these documents between July 25th and September 10th. Even as OMB was implementing the president's hold, officials inside OMB advocated for the release of the funds. On August 7th, OMB staff sent a memo to Director Vaught, recommending removing the hold because the assistance was consistent with the national security strategy in terms of 1, supporting a stable, peaceful Europe, 2, the fact that the aid countered Russian aggression, and 3, that there was bipartisan support for the program. This meant that experts at every single relevant agency involved opposed the hold. By mid-August, DoD raised concerns that it might not be able to fully spend the DoD funds before the end of the fiscal year. Laura Cooper testified that DoD estimated $100 million of the aid was at risk of not getting to Ukraine. DoD concluded that it could no longer support OMB's claim that the footnotes, quote, that, quote, this brief pause in obligations will not preclude DoD's timely execution of the final policy direction, end quote. Sandy testified that this sentence in the footnote was, quote, at the heart of that issue about ensuring that we don't run afoul of the Impoundment Control Act. Records produced in response to a FOIA lawsuit show that Mr. Duffy and Ms. McCusker exchanged emails on August 20th, and on that date, OMB modified the footnote. These emails are almost entirely redacted. However, all the subsequent footnotes issued by OMB during the pendency of the hold removed the sentence regarding DoD's ability to fully obligate the funds by the end of the fiscal year. Nevertheless, OMB continued to implement the hold at the President's direction. We know from emails released last night that as of September 5th, OMB was continuing to instruct DOD to hold the aid. OMB gave these emails to a private organization just because of a FOIA lawsuit. On September 5th, Duffy emailed McCusker the following, quote, "No movement from Ukraine. Footnote forthcoming to continue hold through Friday," end quote. We know that McCusker responded to OMB with a lengthy email detailing DOD's serious concerns, but OMB redacted almost the whole thing. As I explained last night, OMB has key documents that President Trump has refused to turn over to Congress. Key documents that go to the heart of one of the ways in which the President abused his power. Concerns about whether the administration was bending, if not breaking the law, contributed to at least 2 OMB officials resigning, including an attorney in OMB. According to Sandy, one colleague specifically disagreed with OMB General Counsel about the application of the Impoundment Control Act. As I mentioned earlier, the Independent and Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office has already said that the hold was illegal. But you remember the OMB correspondence referencing the, quote, interagency process. As we now know, there was no interagency process. It had ended months before. They made it up. They had to make it up because they couldn't say the real reason for the hold. Sometime prior to August 16th, Ambassador Bolton had a one-on-one meeting with President Trump. According to Morrison, at that meeting, the President, quote, was not ready to approve the release of the assistance. Ambassador Bolton instructed Morrison to look for other opportunities to get the President's cabinet together to, quote, have the direct, in-person conversation with the President about this topic. Everyone was worried, including the President's national security advisor. In mid-August, Colonel Vidman drafted a presidential decision memorandum for Ambassador Bolton to present to President Trump for a decision on Ukraine security assistance. The memorandum recommended that the hold be lifted. Morrison testified that the memorandum was never provided to the President because of other competing issues. Morrison testified that a meeting with the President was never arranged in August, reportedly because of scheduling problems. According to recent press reports, on August 30th, Secretary of Defense Esper, Secretary of State Pompeo met with President Trump and implored him to release the security assistance because doing so was in the interests of the United States. However, President Trump continued to ignore everybody. Later that day, Duffy emailed Undersecretary of Defense Elaine McCusker and wrote, quote, clear direction from POTUS to hold. The Ukrainian government knew of President Trump's hold on security assistance well before it was publicly reported on August 28th. This was not surprising. U.S. diplomat Catherine Croft testified it was, quote, inevitable that it was eventually going to come out. She said 2 individuals from the Ukrainian embassy here in Washington approached her approximately a week apart, quote, quietly and in confidence, to ask me about an OMB hold on Ukraine security assistance. She could not precisely recall the dates of these conversations, but testified that she was, quote, very surprised at the effectiveness of my Ukrainian counterparts. Everyone was worried. So why would these diplomats quietly make this inquiry? It's because if it had gone public, it would show that weakness against Russia that was so concerning to everybody involved. She said, quote, I think that if this were public in Ukraine, it would be seen as a reversal of our policy. It would be a really big deal in Ukraine and an expression of declining U.S. support for Ukraine. Meanwhile, Laura Cooper testified that DOD heard from the Ukrainian embassy on July 25th, the same day as President Trump's call to President Zelensky.
On July 25th, a member of my staff got a question from a Ukraine embassy contact asking what was going on with Ukraine security assistance. because at that time, we did not know what the guidance was on USAI. The OMB notice of apportionment arrived that day, but this staff member did not find out about it until later. I was informed that the staff member told the Ukrainian official that we were moving forward on USAI, but recommended that the Ukraine embassy check in with state regarding the FMF.
USAI referred to the $250 million that OMB blocked DoD from sending to Ukraine. FMF referred to the $141 million that they blocked from the State Department. On July 25th, Cooper's staff also received 2 emails from the State Department revealing that the Ukrainian embassy was, quote, asking about security assistance, and that the Hill knows about the FMF situation to an extent, and so does the Ukrainian embassy. One of Cooper's staff members reported additional contacts with Ukrainian officials about the hold in August. Finally, we know the Ukrainians knew about the hold because the New York Times published an interview with the former Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine, Elena Zerkal. She stated that she and President Zelensky's office received a cable in late July informing them of the hold. In short, by the time of Politico's report on August 28th, the Ukrainians were well aware that the aid was not only important, was not the only important official act that the White House was withholding from them. The long-sought White House visit for President Zelensky was also in limbo. As all of this transpired, Ukrainian troops were still on the front lines in eastern Ukraine, facing off against Russian-backed forces, dying in defense of their country. Ambassador Bill Taylor visited those Ukrainian troops on July 26. He recalled seeing, quote, the armed and hostile Russian-led force on the other side of the damaged bridge across the line of the contact. When asked to reflect on that visit, here is what Ambassador Taylor had to say.
Let's talk about July 26th, a lot of years later. You go to the front, you go to Donbass with Ambassador Volker, I believe, and you're on the bridge and you're looking over on the front line at the Russian soldiers. Is that what you recalled?
Yes, sir.
And you said the commander there, the Ukrainian commander, thanked you for the American military assistance that you knew was being withheld at that moment.
That's correct.
How'd that make you feel, sir?
Badly.
Why?
Because it was clear that that commander counted on us. It was clear that that commander had confidence in us. It was clear that that commander was appreciative of the capabilities that he was given by that assistance, but also the reassurance that we were supporting him.
Like me, Ambassador Taylor is a combat veteran. In fact, he was awarded a Bronze Star. Ambassador Taylor knew how vital our military aid was to those Ukrainian troops because he knows what it feels like to have people counting on you. Members of the U.S. Senate, I know you believe that aid is important too, because 87 members of this body voted to support it. President Trump did not think the aid was important last year. He ignored you and the direction of Congress. He betrayed the confidence of our Ukrainian partners and U.S. national security when he corruptly withheld that aid. And he did so because he simply wanted to help his own political campaign. Our men and women in uniform deserve better. Our friends and allies deserve better. The American people deserve better.
Chief Justice Roberts, senators, and counsel for the President. Now I want to talk to you about the White House meeting that President Trump offered to President Zelensky during their first phone call in April. But as you know, that meeting has not been scheduled. It was never scheduled. Ambassador Sondland testified that after the May 23rd meeting with President Trump, it became clear that President Zelensky would not be invited to the Oval Office until he announced the opening of investigations that would benefit President Trump's re-election. During his testimony, Ambassador Sondland stressed that it was a clear quid pro quo. Let's listen.
I know that members of this committee frequently frame these complicated issues in the form of a simple question: was there a quid pro quo? As I testified previously, with regard to the requested White House call and the White House meeting, the answer is yes. Mr. Giuliani conveyed to Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volker, and others that President Trump wanted a public statement from President Zelensky committing to investigations of Burisma and the 2016 election. Mr. Giuliani expressed those requests directly to the Ukrainians, and Mr. Giuliani also expressed those requests directly to us. We all understood that these prerequisites for the White House call and the White House meeting reflected President Trump's desires and requirements.
Ambassador Sondland also testified that the scheme to pressure Ukraine into fulfilling the president's requirements for an Oval Office meeting became progressively and more specific and problematic, what he described as a continuum of insidiousness. He explained the evolution from generic requests to investigate corruption to calls to pursue specific allegations against President Trump's political opponents. Here is Ambassador Sondland again.
Well, Mr. Chairman, when we left the Oval Office, I believe on May 23rd, the request was very generic for an investigation of corruption in a very vanilla sense, and dealing with some of the oligarch problems in Ukraine, which were long-standing problems. And then as time went on, more specific items got added to the menu, including the Burisma and 2016 election meddling specifically, the DNC server specifically. And over this continuum, it became more and more difficult to secure the White House meeting because more conditions were being placed on the White House meeting.
In short, Ambassadors Volker and Sondland understood that to get the meeting scheduled, they needed to get Mr. Giuliani's agreement first. On June 27, Ambassador Sondland explained to Ambassador Taylor that President Trump needed to hear from the Ukrainian leader before he would consent to a White House meeting. Here is how Ambassador Taylor explained it.
On June 27th, Ambassador Sondland told me during a phone conversation that President Zelensky needed to make clear to President Trump that he, President Zelensky, was not standing in the way of investigations.
Diplomat David Holmes testified that he understood early on the investigations to mean the Burisma-Biden investigations that Mr. Giuliani and his associates had been speaking about publicly. Mr. Holmes noted that while President Trump was withholding an Oval meeting with Ukraine's newly elected leader, he agreed to meet with Ukraine's chief foe, Vladimir Putin. Mr. Holmes had this to say.
Also on June 28th, while President Trump was still not moving forward on a meeting with President Zelensky, he met with Russian President Putin at the G20 summit in Osaka, Japan, sending a further signal of lack of support to Ukraine.
Ambassador Volker did not dispute other witnesses' testimony that President Trump conditioned Oval Office meetings on President Zelensky's willingness to announce investigations. Indeed, Ambassador Volker helped matters along. Ambassador Volker testified that at a conference in early July, he suggested that President Zelensky speak to President Trump on the phone to discuss the investigations. During his testimony, Ambassador Volker described that encounter.
And in the July 2nd or 3rd meeting in Toronto that you had with President Zelensky, you also mentioned investigations to him,
Yes.
right? And again, you were referring to the Burisma
I was thinking
in
of
2016.
Burisma in 2016.
Okay. And you understood that that's what the Ukrainians interpreted references to investigations to be related to Burisma and the 2016 election.
I don't know specifically at that time if we had talked to that specifically, Burisma 2016 with President Zelensky. That was my assumption, though, that they would have been thinking that too.
Mr. Giuliani became an inescapable presence to both Ukrainian officials and American diplomats. To the Ukrainians, Rudy Giuliani was seen as both a potential channel to President Trump and an obstacle to a productive U.S.-Ukraine relationship. A top aide to President Zelensky texts to Volker that, "I feel that the key for many things is Rudy, and I'm ready to talk with him at any time." But everyone understood that Mr. Giuliani was no rogue agent. He was acting at the direction of the president. Ambassador Sondland clearly described Mr. Giuliani's role in regard to the president. Let's listen.
Mr. Giuliani's requests were a quid pro quo for arranging a White House visit for President Zelensky. Mr. Giuliani demanded that Ukraine make a public statement announcing the investigations of the 2016 election, DNC server, and Burisma. Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States, and we knew these investigations were important to the President.
Concerned about Mr. Giuliani's influence began to grow. On July 10th, at a meeting between Ambassador Taylor and 2 Ukrainian officials in Kyiv, Ukrainian officials said they were very concerned because Mr. Giuliani had told the corrupt Prosecutor General Lysenko that President Trump would not meet with the Ukrainian leader. Back in Washington, 2 important encounters at the White House further revealed the existence of a corrupt quid pro quo. Ambassador Sondland first broached the investigation in a meeting in Ambassador Bolton's office with Bolton's Ukrainian counterpart and President Zelensky's top aide. Also present were Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volker, and NSC officials Dr. Hill and Lieutenant Colonel Vindman. Toward the end of the meeting, the Ukrainians raised the topic of an Oval Office meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky. Ambassador Bolton started to respond when Ambassador Sondland interjected and raised the demands of the investigation. Here is how Lieutenant Colonel Vindman recalled the conversation.
To the best of my recollection, Ambassador Sondland said that in order to get a White House meeting, the Ukrainians would have to provide a deliverable, which is investigations, specific investigations.
Ambassador Volker separately confirmed this recollection during his testimony.
I participated in the July 10th meeting between National Security Advisor Bolton and then Ukrainian Chairman of the National Security and Defense Council, Alex Danylyuk. As I remember, the meeting was essentially over when Ambassador Sondland made a general comment about investigations. I think all of us thought it was inappropriate.
Ambassador Bolton also found Ambassador Sondland's reference to be inappropriate, and he abruptly ended the meeting. However, Ambassador Sondland was not deterred. He convened a second meeting where he discussed what needed to happen before an Oval Office meeting. Apparently, Ambassador Sondland had received his marching orders from the president, and he was determined to carry them out. Bolton sent Dr. Hill to join that meeting and report back, and this is what Dr. Hill had to say.
And so when I came in, Gordon Sondland was basically saying, well, look, we have a deal here that there will be a meeting. I have a deal here with Chief of Staff Mulvaney. There will be a meeting if the Ukrainians open up or announce these investigations into 2016 in Burisma. And I cut it off immediately there. Because by this point, having heard Mr. Giuliani over and over again on the television and all of the issues that he was asserting, by this point it was clear that Burisma was code for the Bidens, because Giuliani was laying it out there.
After the meeting, Dr. Hill followed up with Ambassador Bolton and relayed what transpired. Bolton was alarmed. In other words, Ambassador Bolton didn't want any part of it. He directed Dr. Hill to brief the NSC's top attorney, John Eisenberg, as she explained during her hearing.
What was that
Question that you're
specific
asking. So
instruction?
the specific instruction was that I had to go to the lawyers, to John Eisenberg, our senior counsel for the National Security Council, to basically say, you tell Eisenberg, Ambassador Bolton told me, that I am not part of this whatever drug deal that Mulvaney and Sondland are cooking up.
What did you understand him to mean by the drug deal that Mulvaney and Sondland were cooking up?
I took it to mean investigations for a meeting.
Did you go speak to the lawyers?
I certainly did.
Senators, as a former chief of police, I think it's quite interesting that Ambassador Bolton categorized the corrupt scheme, the pressure campaign, as a, quote, drug deal. I think that Ambassador Bolton was trying to send us a very powerful message. A message that not only would the lawyers, the top lawyer, understand, but that every person would understand. Every member of the House, every member of the Senate, every member of our great country, every citizen. And Ambassador Bolton also wanted to make clear, especially to the top attorney, that he did not want to have anything to do with a drug deal in progress. But we do know. We know now, of course, that Ambassador Bolton can testify directly about this. He can testify directly for himself about this meeting if he appears before this body, as he has indicated that he is prepared to do if this body is willing to issue a subpoena. We need to hear from Ambassador Bolton, and I know the American people want to hear from Ambassador Bolton as well. Dr. Hill testified that she spoke to Mr. Eisenberg twice. Dr. Hill also indicated that Mr. Eisenberg took notes of their meeting, which we, to no surprise now, do not have, we have not received because of the president's obstruction. It's clear Ambassador Sondland was not operating a rogue operation. He testified that everyone was in the loop. Let's listen once again.
Everyone was in the loop. It was no secret. Everyone was informed via email on July 19th, days before the presidential call. As I communicated to the team, I told President Zelensky in advance that assurances to run a fully transparent investigation and turn over every stone were necessary in his call with President Trump.
In the email referenced, Ambassador Sondland wrote the following to Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Perry, and Mr. Mulvaney regarding President Zelensky. He is prepared to receive POTUS's call. We'll assure him that he intends to run a fully transparent investigation and will turn over every stone. Both Mulvaney and Perry responded to the email, noting that the head of state call would be scheduled right away. Now, you may be asking, what did Mulvaney know about these investigations? And did he have any conversations with President Trump about them? Senators, this body is entitled to see all of the evidence. And you know what? The American people are entitled to hear all of the evidence. And while the nature of the drug deal we've talked about was uncontested, it is important for the country to know that everyone was involved. Because we've heard it, everyone was in the loop. Now, later that day, July 19th, Ambassador Sondland texted Ambassadors Volker and Taylor about the upcoming head of state telephone call. And the text said, "Looks like POTUS call tomorrow." I spoke directly to Zelensky and gave him a full briefing. He's got it. Ambassador Volker replied to Sondland's text, "Most important is for Zelensky to say that he will help investigations." The evidence shows that the Ukrainians understood what they needed to do to earn a White House meeting with the president. On July 20th, the day after Ambassador Sondland's phone call with President Zelensky, Ambassador Taylor spoke with the Ukrainian National Security Advisor. Ukraine's National Security Advisor conveyed that the Ukrainian president did not want to become an instrument in U.S. politics. Here is how Ambassador Taylor explained that concern.
What did you understand it to mean when that Zelensky had concerns about being an instrument in Washington domestic re-election politics?
Mr. Daniluk understood that these investigations were pursuant to Mr. Giuliani's request to develop information, to find information about Burisma and the Bidens. This was very well known in public. Mr. Giuliani had made this point clear in several instances in the beginning, in the springtime, and Mr. Daniluk was aware that that was a problem.
And would you agree that because President Zelensky is worried about this, they understood at least that there was some pressure for them to pursue these investigations? Is that fair?
Mr. Daniluk indicated that President Zelensky certainly understood it, that he did not want to get involved in these type of activities.
The next day, Ambassador Taylor relayed the Ukrainian leader's concerns to Volker and Sondland. But Ambassador Sondland did not back down. Specifically, Ambassador Sondland texted in response to Ambassador Taylor's worry. "Absolutely, but we need to get the conversation started and the relationship built, irrespective of the pretext." Again, Ambassador Sondland had his marching orders, and he was determined to carry them out. A call between President Trump and President Zelensky was scheduled for July 25th. Before the call, President Trump spoke to Sondland and reiterated his expectation that the Ukrainian leader would commit to the investigations. Ambassador Sondland subsequently contacted Ambassadors Volker and relayed the message to him. Volker then texted Zelensky's top aide with President Trump's instructions. Assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate, get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, we will nail down the date for a visit to Washington. Senators, in other words, even before the July 25th phone call with President Zelensky, before it ever took place, Ukraine understood what it needed to initiate, that it needed to initiate the investigations into the debunked conspiracy theory about the 2016 election as a condition for President Zelensky, the newly elected Ukrainian president, to visit the White House. Ambassador Sondland testified that acting on President Trump's direct orders, he and Ambassador Volker prepped President Zelensky for the telephone call.
And you would agree that the message in this that is expressed here is that President Zelensky needs to convince Trump that he will do the investigations in order to nail down the date for a visit to Washington, D.C. Is that correct?
That's correct.
By this time, nonpartisan career officials involved with Ukraine policy had become aware of this quid pro quo. Here is what 3 of them said during their testimony. Ambassador Taylor, the meeting President Zelensky wanted was conditioned on investigations of Burisma and alleged Ukrainian influence in the 2016 elections. Ambassador David Holmes, it was made clear that some action on a Burisma-Biden investigation was a precondition for an Oval Office visit. Dr. Hill, there seems to be an awful lot of people involved. You know, basically turning a White House meeting into some kind of asset that was dangled out to the Ukrainian government. A White House visit, a visit to the Oval Office dangled out to the Ukrainian government. Senators, I ask you to think about those words as we decide, as you decide, what action you will take. Think about those words. There was no doubt the direction came from the President of the United States. The President was the center of this scheme. Ambassador Sondland testified that Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States, and we knew these investigations were important to the President. Ambassador Sondland added that Mr. Giuliani followed the direction of the President, and we followed the President's orders. However, as Ambassador Taylor testified, Ambassador Bolton was not interested in having, did not want to have the call because he thought it was going to be a disaster. He thought that there could be some talk of investigations or even worse than that. He thought, what was Ambassador, I ask you today, Senators, what was Ambassador Bolton so afraid that President Trump would say to the newly elected Ukrainian president? What was the National Security Advisor so afraid that President Trump would say to President Zelensky? This is another topic we'd like to ask Ambassador Bolton about if and when he appears before this body.
Mr. Chief Justice, distinguished members of the Senate, I thank you once again for your indulgence and for your courtesy as we all undertake our solemn constitutional responsibilities during this Senate trial. George Washington once observed in his farewell address to the nation that the Constitution is sacredly obligatory upon all. That means everyone. And in fact, that is what makes our great country so distinct from authoritarian regimes and enemies of democracy. Vladimir Putin is above the law in Russia. Erdogan is above the law in Turkey. Kim Jong-un is above the law in North Korea. But in the United States of America, no one is above the law, not even the President of the United States. That is what this moment is all about. As we all know, Congress is a separate and co-equal branch of government. We don't work for this president or any president. We, of course, work for the American people. We have a constitutional responsibility to serve as a check and balance on an out-of-control executive branch. That is not the Democratic Party playbook. That is not the Republican Party playbook. That is the playbook in a democratic republic. James Madison once observed in Federalist 51 that the Congress should serve as a rival to the executive branch. In my humble opinion, why would Madison use the word rival? It's because the framers of the Constitution, I think, did not want a king. They did not want a dictator. They did not want a monarch. They wanted a democracy. The Constitution is sacredly obligatory upon all. It is through that lens that we proceed today. For the next few moments, I would like to discuss President Trump's July 25th phone call with Ukraine's newly elected leader. The president claims that his call was perfect. Nothing can be further from the truth. The call is direct evidence of President Trump's solicitation of foreign interference in the 2020 election as part of a corrupt scheme. It is important, of course, to remember the context of this call. The new Ukrainian president, Vladimir Zelensky, was in a vulnerable position and viewed American and diplomatic military support as critical to his standing and to Ukraine's fragile future as a democracy. Equally significant, as outlined by my colleagues, America has a strong national security interest in supporting Ukraine against Russia's continued aggression. William Taylor, West Point graduate, Vietnam War hero, ambassador to Ukraine, appointed by Donald Trump, testified, Ukraine is a strategic partner of the United States, important for the security of our country as well as Europe. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, National Security Council officer, Trump appointee, Purple Heart recipient, Iraq War veteran, testified a strong and independent Ukraine is critical to our national security interests. Ukraine remains under attack by Russian-backed separatists in Crimea. It is an ongoing hot war. Ukraine is a friend, Russia is a foe. Ukraine is a democracy, Russia is a dictatorship. The United States may very well be one of the only things standing between Russia and Ukraine being completely overrun as part of Vladimir Putin's continued aggression against the free world. That is why this Congress allocated $391 million in military and security aid to a vulnerable Ukraine on a bipartisan basis, because it is in America's national security interests. On the July 25th call, Mr. Trump could have endeavored to strengthen the relationship with this new Ukrainian leader. Instead, President Trump focused on securing a personal favor. He wanted Ukraine to conduct phony investigations designed to enhance his political standing and solicit foreign interference in the 2020 election. On the July 25th call, President Trump maligned a highly respected American ambassador known as an anti-corruption crusader. At the same time, he praised a corrupt former Ukrainian prosecutor. And on multiple occasions, President Trump directed Ukraine's new leader to speak with his personal lawyer, Rudolph Giuliani, on an official call. Mr. Giuliani is not a member of the Trump administration. For these and other reasons, the July 25th call warrants our close scrutiny. It presents significant and shocking evidence of President Trump's corrupt intent. The call lays bare the president's willingness to do whatever it takes to get what he wants, even if his behavior undermines the national security interests of the United States of America. At the beginning of the call, President Zelensky mentioned U.S. military aid, and he states, "I would also like to thank you for your great support in the area of defense." The great support in the area of defense includes the security assistance passed by this Congress on a bipartisan basis that Donald Trump held up in violation of the law. Immediately after President Zelensky raised the issue of defense support, President Trump responded, "I would like you to do us a favor, though." These words will live in infamy. First, President Trump said to President Zelensky, as part of the two demands that he requested, "I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation in Ukraine. They say CrowdStrike. I guess you have one of your wealthy people, the server, they say, Ukraine has it." President Trump continued, "I would like to have the Attorney General call you or your people, and I would like you to get to the bottom of it. As you saw yesterday, that whole nonsense ended with a very poor performance by a man named Robert Mueller, a Vietnam War hero, by the way. A very poor performance by a man named Robert Mueller, an incompetent performance. But they say a lot of it started with Ukraine." whatever you can do, it's very important that you do it if that's possible. Who is the they referred to by President Trump, putting forth the baseless conspiracy theory that the Ukrainians, not the Russians, were behind the hack of the Democratic National Committee server in 2016? They means Russia. They means Putin. They are enemies of the United States. Not a single witness who testified before the House knew of any factual basis for President Trump's belief in the CrowdStrike Ukraine fairy tale. To the contrary, the U.S. intelligence community and this Senate Intelligence Committee assessed that Russia interfered in the 2016 election. As Dr. Fiona Hill testified, the theory that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election is, quote, a fictional narrative that has been perpetrated and propagated by the Russian security services. The conspiracy theory that President Trump advanced on the July 25th phone call is stone-cold Russian propaganda. As early as February 2017, Vladimir Putin began to promote this lie during a press conference, saying, quote, the Ukrainian government adopted a unilateral position in favor of one candidate. More than that, certain oligarchs, certainly with the approval of the political leadership, funded this candidate, or female candidate, to be precise. Those are the words of Vladimir Putin, a script apparently adopted by President Donald John Trump. If there was any doubt about who benefits from this unfounded, Russian-inspired conspiracy theory advanced by Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin made it clear when he said in November of 2019, thank God no one is accusing us anymore of interfering in U.S. elections. Now they're accusing Ukrainians. Unfortunately, this is not the first time President Trump tried to capitalize on Russian propaganda and misinformation for his own political benefit. On July 24th, just one day before this call, Special Counsel Robert Mueller testified before Congress that the Russian government interfered in the 2016 election in sweeping and systematic fashion in order to support the Trump campaign and divide America. Mr. Mueller also found that the Trump campaign welcomed Russian interference in the 2016 election and utilized it as part of its campaign messaging. Despite the clear and overwhelming conclusion of U.S. intelligence agencies, as well as the distinguished Senate Intelligence Committee, that Russia, not Ukraine, interfered in the 2016 election, President Trump continued to press the new Ukrainian leader to announce an investigation into the CrowdStrike Ukraine conspiracy theory. Why? President Trump sought a political favor. That's why. As part of a scheme to solicit foreign interference in the 2020 election. The second demand made by President Trump on the July 25th call related to the campaign of Vice President Joe Biden, who announced his intention to run for the office of the presidency last April. Throughout the spring and early summer of last year, public polling consistently showed that Biden would decisively defeat President Trump. In fact, on June 16th of last year, June 16th, a Fox News poll showed that President Trump would lose to Joe Biden by 10 points. The concern with Joe Biden's candidacy provides motive for President Trump's demand that the Ukrainian government investigate the former vice president and his son, Hunter. Here is what President Trump said on that call. The other thing, there's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution. And a lot of people want to find out about that, so whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution, so if you can look into it, it sounds horrible to me. Now, the Trump administration officials who participated in the impeachment inquiry unanimously testified that there was no factual support for the allegation that Vice President Biden did anything wrong or misused his authority when he pressed for the removal of Ukraine's corrupt former prosecutor general. Joe Biden did nothing wrong. The witnesses testified that Vice President Biden was in fact carrying out official U.S. policy to clean up the Prosecutor General's office in Ukraine. This policy, of course, aligned with the perspective of many in this very distinguished body, as well as our European allies throughout the world, as well as the International Monetary Fund. Vice President Biden did not remove Yuri Lutsenko, the corrupt prosecutor. The Ukrainian government did, with the support of the free world. Nonetheless, on October 3rd, 2019, when a reporter asked President Trump, "What exactly did you hope Zelensky would do about the Bidens after your phone call?" President Trump responded as follows.
Mr. President, what exactly did you hope Zelensky would do about the Bidens after your phone call? Exactly.
Well, I would think that if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Bidens. It's a very simple answer.
Start a major investigation into the Bidens. The evidence of wrongdoing by President Trump is hiding in plain sight. During the July 25th call, President Trump also repeatedly pressed the Ukrainian president to coordinate with his personal attorney, Rudolph Giuliani. Why was Rudolph Giuliani's name mentioned multiple times during the July 25th phone call? Giuliani is not the Secretary of State. He's not an ambassador. He's not a member of the diplomatic corps. Rudolph Giuliani is a cold-blooded political operative for President Trump's re-election campaign. That is why he was referenced multiple times on that July 25th phone call. And it is evidence of corrupt intent by President Trump. By the time the call took place, President Zelensky understood Giuliani's connection to the shakedown scheme. He recognized Giuliani's role as the president's political operative as matters related to Ukraine. Zelensky informed President Trump that one of his aides spoke with Mr. Giuliani just recently, and we are hoping very much that Mr. Giuliani will be able to travel to Ukraine and we will meet once he comes. The Ukrainian leader knew Giuliani represented President Trump's political interest in his country and could help unlock the long sought-after Oval Office meeting that President Zelensky desired. The phony investigations sought by President Trump on the July 25th call were not designed to bolster the national security interests of the United States of America. Quite the contrary, President Trump sought to benefit himself and his own re-election prospects. On the July 25th call, President Trump also suggested that President Zelensky speak with the Attorney General, William Barr, about the two fake investigations that the president sought. This is important to keep in mind. At no time during this entire sordid scheme was there an ongoing American law enforcement investigation into the phony slander related to Joe Biden or the conspiracy theory related to Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election. At no time was there an ongoing American law enforcement investigation. America is the leader of the free world. We do not urge other sovereign countries to target American citizens, absent any legitimate basis whatsoever, absent any scintilla of evidence. Apparently, President Trump does not play by those rules. During the July 25th call, President Trump didn't raise legitimate corruption concerns as it relates to Ukraine. President Trump did not mention the word corruption once. The president did, however, viciously malign former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, a distinguished anti-corruption advocate whom he abruptly removed because she was seen as an obstacle to his geopolitical shakedown. Ambassador Yovanovitch joined the diplomatic corps under President Ronald Reagan and subsequently served 3 other Republican presidents. She is a highly respected diplomat and foreign service professional. Yet, President Trump told the new Ukrainian leader, the former ambassador from the United States, the woman, was bad news, and the people she was dealing with in the Ukraine were bad news. So I just want to let you know that. He didn't stop there. Later in the call, President Trump ominously added, well, she's going to go through some things. These are the words of the President of the United States of America. Ambassador Yovanovitch did not know of President Trump's disparaging remarks at the time. She didn't learn of them until the call record became public in September. Asked whether she felt threatened by President Trump's statement that she was going to go through some things, Ambassador Yovanovitch answered that she did. Here is what she said.
The next excerpt, when the president references you, was a short one, but he said, well, she's going to go through some things. What did you think when President Trump told President Zelensky, and you read, that you were going to go through some things?
I didn't know what to think, but I was very concerned.
What were you concerned about?
She's going to go through some things. It didn't sound good. It sounded like a threat.
Did you feel threatened?
I did.
During that same call, President Trump also took the opportunity to praise Yuri Lutsenko. Mr. Lutsenko is the former Ukrainian prosecutor general who was widely regarded by the entire free world, including our European allies and the International Monetary Fund, to be corrupt and incompetent. But Donald John Trump, our president, praised him on that call. He told President Zelensky, quote, "I heard you had a prosecutor who was very good, and he was shut down, and that's really unfair. A lot of people are talking about that, the way they shut your very good prosecutor down. And you had some very bad people involved." Think about this contrast. The president bashed a career American diplomat, an anti-corruption champion, who he unceremoniously removed because she was viewed as an obstacle to his efforts to solicit foreign interference in the 2020 election, and at the same time praised someone who he thought could be an asset, a corrupt Ukrainian prosecutor, who the free world viewed as an obstacle to the rule of law. The idea that President Trump cares about corruption is laughable. It's laughable. Plain reading of the rough transcript of the July 25th call also sheds light on the quid pro quo involving the Oval Office meeting that had been sought. President Zelensky said on the call, "I also wanted to thank you for your invitation to visit the United States, specifically Washington, D.C. On the other hand, I also wanted to ensure that we will be very serious about the case and will work on the investigation." As all of you know, here in this distinguished body, quid pro quo is a Latin term. It means this for that. Statement that I just read shows that President Zelensky fully understood at the time of this July 25th call that if he yielded to President Trump's demand for phony investigations, he would get the White House meeting in the Oval Office that he desperately sought. This for that. President Trump has repeatedly insisted that his July 25th conversation with President Zelensky was a perfect call. His staff at the White House apparently believed otherwise. The press office issued a short and incomplete summary of the July 25th call. Let me read it for your hearing. Today, President Donald J. Trump spoke by telephone with President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine to congratulate him on his recent
Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery.
And the scripture says, "For the Lord loves justice and will not abandon his faithful ones." Official White House call readout, July 25th, 2019. Today, President Donald J. Trump spoke by telephone with President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine to congratulate him on his recent election. President Trump and President Zelensky discussed ways to strengthen the relationship between the United States and Ukraine, including energy and economic cooperation. Both leaders also expressed that they look forward to the opportunity to meet. That is the official White House call readout dated July 25th, 2019. The official readout provided to the American people omitted key elements of the president's conversation. Let's review. The official readout did not mention the phony investigations requested by President Trump. The official readout did not mention the Oval Office meeting sought by President Zelensky. The official readout did not mention President Trump's elevation of a debunked conspiracy theory promoted by Vladimir Putin about 2016 election interference. The official readout did not mention President Trump's demand that Ukraine investigate his domestic political rival, Joe Biden. The official readout did not mention that President Trump maligned and threatened Ambassador Yovanovitch. And the official readout did not mention that President Trump praised a corrupt former Ukrainian prosecutor. The complete conversation, however, between President Trump and President Zelensky that we just outlined offers powerful evidence that President Trump abused his power and solicited foreign interference in the 2016 election, the 2020 election. Several members of the president's staff listening in on the call immediately grew concerned. As he sat in the White House Situation Room listening to the conversation, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman realized that the president's demands of the Ukrainian leader were inappropriate and improper. He quickly recognized that as the president began referencing the Bidens and CrowdStrike, the call was diverging from the official National Security Council approved talking points that he helped prepare. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, 20-year Iraq War veteran, Purple Heart recipient, and American patriot. He testified in the context of the call that due to the unequal bargaining position of the two leaders and Ukraine's dependence on the United States, the favor that President Trump sought would have been perceived by President Zelensky as a demand. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman worried that the call would undermine U.S. national security interests, and he knew immediately that he had a duty to report the contents of the call to White House lawyers.
I was concerned by the call. What I heard was inappropriate, and I reported my concerns to Mr. Eisenberg. It is improper for the President of the United States to demand a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen and a political opponent. I was also clear that if Ukraine pursued an investigation, it was also clear that if Ukraine pursued an investigation into the 2016 elections, the Bidens and Burisma, it would be interpreted as a partisan play. This would undoubtedly result in Ukraine losing bipartisan support, undermining U.S. national security, and advancing Russia's strategic objectives in the region.
Recounting the content of the call based on his detailed handwritten notes, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman told the lawyers that he believed it was wrong for President Trump to ask President Zelensky to investigate Vice President Biden. Other witnesses were also troubled by what they heard. Vice President Pence's advisor, Jennifer Williams, expressed concern that President Trump raised a domestic political matter on an official call with a foreign leader. She testified that the mention of investigations struck her as unusual and possibly political in nature. She said, "I guess for me, it shed some light on possible other motives behind a security assistance hold." Timothy Morrison, a former Republican congressional staffer who replaced Dr. Fiona Hill in July of 2019, also reported the call to National Security Council lawyers. After the call, President Trump continued to push the scheme forward. On July 26, the very next day, Ambassador Sondland and Ambassador Taylor met with President Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials in Kyiv. According to David Holmes, the Ukraine-based U.S. diplomat who served as the note-taker, the Ukrainian leader mentioned that President Trump had brought up some very sensitive issues during the July 25th call. Very sensitive issues. Ambassador Sondland then had a private meeting with Andrei Yermak, President Zelensky's top aide. The two men insisted that the meeting be one-on-one with no note-taker, perhaps due to the sensitive issues that might come up. Ambassador Sondland testified that he and President Zelensky's aide probably discussed the issue of investigations. After these key moments in Ukraine, Ambassador Sondland went to lunch with David Holmes and two other American officials. Mr. Holmes sat directly across from Ambassador Sondland, close enough to hear the details of an extraordinary telephone call between Mr. Sondland and President Trump. As Mr. Holmes relayed during his sworn testimony under oath, Ambassador Sondland pulled out his unsecured cell phone and said that he was going to call President Trump to give him an update. What happened next was shocking.
While Ambassador Sondland's phone was not on speakerphone, I could hear the president's voice through the earpiece of the phone. The president's voice was loud and recognizable, and Ambassador Sondland held the phone away from his ear for a period of time, presumably because of the loud volume. I heard Ambassador Sondland greet the president and explain he was calling from Kyiv. I heard President Trump then clarify that Ambassador Sondland was in Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland replied yes, he was in Ukraine, and went on to state that President Zelensky, quote, loves your ass. I then heard President Trump ask, so he's going to do the investigation. Ambassador Sondland replied that he's going to do it, adding that President Zelensky will do anything you ask him to do.
He's going to do it. He will do anything you ask him to do. Immediately after this call with President Trump, Mr. Holmes followed up with Ambassador Sondland.
After the call ended, Ambassador Sondland remarked that the president was in a bad mood. As Ambassador Sondland stated, it was often the case early in the morning. I then took the opportunity to ask Ambassador Sondland for his candid impression of the president's views on Ukraine. In particular, I asked Ambassador Sondland if it was true that the president did not give an expletive about Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland agreed that the president did not give an expletive about Ukraine. I asked why not. And Ambassador Sondland stated that the president only cares about big stuff. I noted there was big stuff going on in Ukraine, like a war with Russia. And Ambassador Sondland replied that he meant big stuff that benefits the president, like the Biden investigation that Mr. Giuliani was pushing. The conversation then moved on to other topics.
During the July 25th call, President Trump asked for the favor of these two phony political investigations immediately after the Ukrainian president brought up defense assistance for Ukraine. And the following day, Ambassador Sondland confirmed to President Trump that Ukraine would indeed initiate the investigations discussed on the call, which was the only thing President cared about with respect to Ukraine. He didn't care that Russia was forcefully occupying eastern Ukraine. President Trump didn't care that thousands of Ukrainians apparently have died fighting for their democracy. He didn't seem to care that supporting Ukraine bolsters America's national security. But he cared about himself as it relates to the prospects of his reelection in 2020. In November, President Trump denied that he spoke to Ambassador Sondland on July 26, telling reporters, "I know nothing about that." But in his public testimony, Ambassador Sondland contradicted that assertion with official records he obtained from the White House. Ambassador Sondland further explained that Holmes's testimony refreshed his reelection about the July 26 call, which Ambassador Sondland had not originally described when he first appeared at a deposition before the House.
Also, on July 26, shortly after our Kiev meetings, I spoke by phone with President Trump. The White House, which has finally shared certain call dates and times with my attorneys, confirms this. The call lasted 5 minutes. I remember I was at a restaurant in Kiev, and I have no reason to doubt that this conversation included the subject of investigations. Again, given Mr. Giuliani's demand that President Zelensky make a public statement about investigations, I knew that investigations were important to President Trump.
President Trump said that his July 25th conversation was a perfect call. It was far from perfect. In a perfect call, the president would not demand a political favor from a vulnerable Ukraine under attack by a Russian foe. In a perfect call, the president would not demand that a foreign leader investigate a Russian-inspired conspiracy about the 2016 election. In a perfect call, the president would not pressure a foreign government to target an American citizen for political personal gain. In a perfect call, the president would not solicit foreign interference in the 2020 election. In a perfect call, the president would not threaten the well-being of a highly respected American ambassador and say that she was going to go through some things. In a perfect call, the president would not praise a disgraced former prosecutor who the free world viewed as corrupt and incompetent. And in a perfect call, the president would not have directed a foreign leader to follow up with Rudolph Giuliani, a human hand grenade. This was not a perfect call. It is direct evidence that President Donald John Trump corruptly abused his power and solicited foreign interference in the 2020 election.
The majority leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, colleagues, we'll now take a 30-minute break for dinner and reconvene at 5 minutes after 7 So I ask consent the Senate stand in recess until that time.
Without objection, so ordered.